Okay, I'm going to review adding and subtracting sig figs. So let's look at the example that was in your notes. Alright, so for adding and subtracting sig figs, my advice to you, first of all, is always just to put this in your calculator or just do the math and add them up. So if we add these up, we get 26.54. So here's how adding and subtracting rules apply. You look at how many decimal places each number has. You can see in this number, 25.2, it only goes out to one decimal place. But in the number 1.34, it goes out to two decimal places. So if this number is only out to one decimal place, how can we report an answer out to two decimal places? The answer is we can't. So for adding and subtracting, you look at the least amount of decimal places. So because that first number only goes out to one decimal place, we can only go out to one decimal place. So this is actually not the answer, 26.54. We can only go to one decimal place. So you have to apply rounding rules. There's my one decimal place, right? But because the next number is a 4, I leave it at a 5. I cannot round it up. So the final answer is 26.5. All right, let's look at another one. Okay, so take a second and add these numbers up in your calculator. Now, when you add these up in your calculator, you get 23.269. That's out to three decimal places. Can we report out that many decimal places? The answer is no, because these numbers over here don't go out to that many decimal places. We cannot go out to 3. So, really, the limiting factor is this number right here. Because that number goes out to one decimal place, we can only go out to one decimal place, which would be right here. So, because the next number is a 6, we're actually going to round this up to a 3. So the final answer is 23.3. Hopefully that makes sense. In the next number, if you subtract these, hopefully you don't need a calculator to do this, you get 2.93. Now, decimal places. When you look at this number, 5.0, is that 0 significant using our sig fig rules? The answer is yes, because there's a decimal and it's to the right of the 5. So because this is significant, this goes out to one decimal place. This number goes out to two decimal places. But because this 5.0 only goes out to one decimal place, we're going to chop this down, and the final answer is 2.9. Alright, let's keep going. Now, the next one, we've got a little bit of a challenge, but first, let's add them up in our calculators. Alright, so we get 78.55. Now, are you seeing where the problem is? The problem is here. That number has no decimal places. So because that number has no decimal places, you cannot report your answer out to decimal places. Your answer for this one will be a whole number. More specifically, it'll go out to the ones, because isn't the 3 in the ones place column? So the ones would be right here. But we've got to look at rounding rules. The next number is a 5, so we're going to have to round that up, and our final answer is going to be 79. Hopefully that makes sense. You got to watch out for the whole numbers. Now, the next one gets even trickier. It would be the hardest one on this slide at the moment. So if you plug these in, I get 58.93. Now, the problem is not the 5. The problem is this number here. Do you have any idea why? Well, if we use sig fig rules, is this 0 significant? Nope, it's not. There's no decimal there. That 0 is not significant. So, in this number, that 7 is in the tens place column, right? The tens place. So because whatever instrument was used to measure this number only goes out to the tens, we can only go out to the tens, which would be right here in my final answer. So, looking at rounding rules, if I'm going to round to the tens, my answer is either going to be 50 or 60. Because this is an 8, it's going to be 60. So hopefully that one makes sense. It's the hardest one. But again, because that 0 is in the tens spot, that 7 is in the tens column, we have to go out to the tens on our final answer, and that's why I rounded up to 60. Okay, now, try this one. You take a second and plug it in. Hopefully you get that number. Now, again, my limiting factor is this number right here because it only goes out to 1 decimal place, so which means my answer can only go out to 1 decimal place, which is right here. Because the next number is a 7, we're going to round this up to 1.3, and that's the final answer. Alright, now let's try a couple more. The first one should be simple. The second one I'll have to show you a little trick to do. So let's do the first one. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I get 6.089. So, because this only goes to the tens column, we can the tenths is what I was trying to say, but because it goes out to 1 decimal place, I can only go out to 1 decimal place, which is right here. Because the next number is an 8, I'm going to round it up to 6.1, and there's my final answer. Alright, now, scientific notation and adding. Do not, for adding and subtracting, put it in your calculator. That is not my advice. What I would do is take a moment and take it out of scientific notation so you can see how many decimal places there is. So if you look at this number here, 6.8 times 10 to the minus 2, that's what it looks like out of scientific notation. So now you can see this number goes out to 3 decimal places. It's very helpful to have that visual. The next number, because it's a positive 1, we're going to bump it one more this direction to make the number bigger, and it becomes 94.40. So this one goes out to 2 decimal places. So if you take 94.4 and add 0.068, you get 94.468. So, because this number goes out to 2 decimal places, we can only go out to 2 decimal places, which means that we have to round up that 6 to a 7, and there's your final answer. Alright, so again, to summarize, for adding and subtracting, you need to find the least amount of decimal places. If there are no decimals, looking back at these last 2 here, you look at where the last sig fig was. If it's in the ones column, like this one here, you can only go to the ones. If it's in the tens column, like this one here, then you can only go to the tens. But you look for the least amount of decimal places. And then the other piece of advice, going back to this one, is if you have scientific notation, I would take the number out of scientific notation, see how many decimal places there are, and then do the math. Alright, hopefully that helps.